In 2022, a young man named Bryce Brogal vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only vague clues and countless questions. His girlfriend Cordelia's family couldn't make sense of what had happened, and her father, Michael Ilix, seemed to know more than he was willing to share. What began as an ordinary missing persons case soon evolved into a dark story of deception, revenge, and desperation. What really happened that fateful day, and how deep do the roots of this mystery go? Stay with us as we uncover the truth hidden behind layers of lies and suspicion. A chilly day in a small town in Minnesota didn't suggest anything out of the ordinary. Mist blanketed the streets, adding a damp chill to the air, and the quiet settlement of Center felt particularly empty. It was here that Bryce was last seen, leaving home and heading toward a storage unit with his girlfriend's father. Cordelia Ilix had recently returned home after months of traveling across the country. She had hoped for a warm reception and a bit of peace. Her family lived here in Minnesota, but instead, she found herself at the center of a series of events that sent shivers down her spine. Soon after her return, Cordelia sensed that something wasn't right. Bryce had gone to the storage unit with her father, Michael, to drop off some belongings. The unit was only a few minutes' walk from their house, and the trip should have taken no more than half an hour. But as time passed, Bryce didn't come back. With each passing hour, Cordelia's unease grew. She tried to settle herself after her long journey, took a shower even, but the anxiety refused to fade. Later that day, Michael returned alone. He looked distressed and immediately told Cordelia that Bryce had been detained at the storage facility. Cordelia couldn't understand what was going on. Michael claimed that two dark gray cars had pulled up to them at the storage complex. People who appeared to be some kind of officials stepped out, but they didn't show any identification or introduce themselves. Everything happened so fast that Michael didn't have a chance to question them or get a clear understanding of the situation. The individuals restrained Bryce, placed handcuffs on him, and drove away. The cars were nondescript, their headlights piercing through the growing evening fog, and Michael couldn't recall any details that might help identify them. These words left Cordelia stunned. She immediately tried calling Bryce, but his phone was turned off. She sent him messages, pleading for him to return and explain what had happened. But no response ever came. With each passing minute, Cordelia's worry grew. On Friday, October 28th, after days without any information, she went to the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing person report. At that point, she had no new details to share with the authorities, apart from Michael's confusing account of events. The police quickly launched an investigation. Detectives examined all the messages Cordelia had sent Bryce on the night he went missing. It was clear from the texts that she was panicking, her growing distress evident with every passing hour. Her anxiety seemed to resonate with the investigators as well. What had started as a routine missing persons case began morphing into something far darker and more complicated. Officers questioned Michael Ilix, but his statements were inconsistent and left many unanswered questions, prompting further interviews. Meanwhile, investigators visited the storage facility where Bryce had last been seen. What they found there only deepened the mystery. A sled, drag marks resembling those left by moving heavy objects, and other pieces of evidence that added an ominous layer to the story. The deeper the police delved into the case, the more unsettling the details became. Bryce Brogal's disappearance was turning into a full-blown enigma, fraught with fear and uncertainty. Cordelia, initially trusting her father's account, tried to make sense of the situation, but everything around her seemed increasingly bizarre and incomprehensible. Michael Ilix, fully aware that he'd be the first person the police would call in for questioning after Cordelia's report, attempted to prepare himself. On Friday, October 28th, officers located Michael at a family Halloween party in Brainerd. He agreed to accompany them back to the storage facility and provide a more detailed account of what had happened on the day Bryce went missing. Michael recounted the events, striving to leave no detail out. He explained that he and Bryce had arrived at the storage unit in a white Ford Escape with a trailer to sort through some belongings after the lengthy road trip he and Cordelia had recently taken. The task took about 45 minutes, with Bryce sorting his things to decide what to keep and what to discard. Around 5:45 p.m., they were preparing to leave when something unexpected occurred. As they were getting into the car and pulling out of the storage unit, two dark gray vehicles intercepted them. Michael described the cars as having flashing lights, not the standard ones used by marked patrol cars, but the type typically seen on unmarked law enforcement vehicles. This struck Michael as unusual, raising doubts about the legitimacy of the people inside. According to his account, both he and Bryce were briefly detained by these unidentified individuals. Michael was escorted back to his white Ford Escape, while Bryce was placed in a different vehicle, a dark gray SUV. Michael recalled that the interior of the SUV was unremarkable, except for a small computer mounted on the dashboard. During questioning, Michael described the situation as appearing highly coordinated, involving several individuals. Bryce seemed to realize this wasn't a random event. Before they were separated, Bryce thanked Michael for his help and said nothing more. On the way to the storage unit earlier, they had spoken very little. When Michael asked Bryce about his and Cordelia's trip, Bryce had simply replied that the drive was fine. Both men had been quiet and distant, seemingly uninterested in making conversation. As the investigation continued, hints of tension within the family began to emerge. Michael admitted he was reluctant to spend time with Bryce and felt uneasy around him. Detectives found it curious why Michael had agreed to help Bryce with the storage unit at all, especially without Cordelia being present. Cordelia later explained that she had stayed home because she was exhausted from their long journey and needed time to rest. From Michael's perspective, the trip to the storage unit had been routine, until it was interrupted by the unexpected and unsettling encounter. He speculated that the events might be connected to some kind of trouble Bryce had gotten himself into. Having just returned to town after a lengthy road trip across the U.S., Bryce and Cordelia had spent only a few hours together before the disappearance occurred. Michael suspected that whatever had happened might be tied to their recent travels. Despite his growing discomfort, he cooperated fully with law enforcement, sharing every detail he could remember. But the case only grew darker and more perplexing with each passing day. Michael also recalled how suddenly Cordelia had announced her return. Initially, she had called him on a Sunday, saying she and Bryce would be back in about a week. However, by Monday, she contacted him again, saying they were coming home that very night due to an unexpected situation. The abrupt change in plans struck Michael as odd, almost as if they had been swept up in something serious and beyond their control, possibly even something criminal. Cordelia and Bryce set off on their road trip right after her graduation in June. For 4 months, they traveled across multiple states, exploring new places, staying in budget motels, and occasionally sleeping in their car. It was a time of freedom, without obligations, but a lot could have happened during that period, things that might explain the noticeable change in the dynamics of their relationship upon their return. Michael, Cordelia's father, had a distinct sense that something was off. He noticed subtle but telling details. Cordelia seemed withdrawn, her demeanor more subdued. She had even developed odd habits, like avoiding conversations when Bryce was in the house. After Bryce was taken by unknown individuals, Michael returned home filled with questions. He approached Cordelia, trying to get to the bottom of what had happened. He mentioned that during Bryce's detainment, there was a reference to Arizona. At first, Cordelia tried to brush it off, insisting everything was fine and there was no danger. But her reassurances felt forced, as if she were hiding something. Eventually, under her father's persistent questioning, she admitted that police had intervened a few times in the past. Specifically, officers had been called when she showed up to work with visible bruises on her face. Each time, she downplayed the situation, insisting nothing serious had occurred and declining to press charges. For Michael, this revelation was alarming. It confirmed his fears that there were deeper issues in her relationship with Bryce. He could see that she was afraid to tell the full truth. The previous spring, in March, Bryce had come to stay with Cordelia's family for a while. From the moment he arrived, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. At first, the changes were subtle. Minor remarks, awkward silences, and tense interactions that could be dismissed as typical disagreements. But it didn't take long for the conflicts to escalate. One morning, Cordelia came downstairs with a noticeable bruise on her face. When her parents asked what had happened, she claimed she had tripped during a scuffle and hit her face. Michael didn't believe her explanation, but Cordelia was adamant. Another one of Michael's daughters, who had been staying at the house at the time, told him she had heard Cordelia crying in her room that night. This only deepened Michael's concerns. Michael knew something serious was happening in their relationship, but he wasn't sure how to help his daughter. The tension between Bryce and Cordelia grew more intense by the day, with arguments becoming a near-daily occurrence. The strain on the household became unbearable, and Michael found himself constantly on edge, worried about what might happen next. After Bryce was detained by unidentified individuals at the storage unit, Michael returned home with a growing sense that the situation was spiraling out of control. He feared that Cordelia might disappear next, or worse, that she had already been taken alongside Bryce. The waiting and uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Unsure of whom to trust or what steps to take, Michael tried to get more information from Cordelia about their recent travels. She mentioned that they had been to Washington State not long ago, which further alarmed him. He also recalled that the individuals who detained Bryce had mentioned Arizona, and Michael knew that Cordelia and Bryce had been in Arizona just weeks earlier. These details only deepened his suspicion that their travels might be tied to something illicit. Michael also shared with the police that Bryce was an avid user of marijuana. This concerned him deeply, as he suspected that involvement with banned substances might have played a role in their problems. He noted another peculiar detail. Both Bryce and Cordelia carried two phones, a standard smartphone and an older flip phone, which could be discarded without leaving a trace if necessary. Investigators were particularly interested in finding Bryce's phones, believing they could hold critical information. However, Michael admitted he didn't know where the phones were. Cordelia also seemed reluctant to talk about them, sidestepping questions and avoiding the topic altogether. Investigators began to develop theories that Bryce's disappearance might have been a staged event or part of an attempt to go into hiding. Certain details suggested that this might have been premeditated. However, Michael doubted Bryce would willingly vanish, especially leaving Cordelia behind in such uncertainty. He believed the situation was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. Cordelia told Michael that she and Bryce had been planning to return to Montana to find work and start over. However, she also revealed troubling aspects of their relationship, describing Bryce as controlling. She confided that he monitored her phones and checked all her emails. Michael saw fear in his daughter, which only heightened his own anxiety. He desperately wanted to help her, but it was clear she wasn't ready to fully open up about what had really been happening between her and Bryce. Investigators discovered that Bryce had been monitoring Cordelia's phone activity. He insisted that all her devices be connected to his so he could track her contacts and review every message and call. As part of the investigation, the police asked Michael to provide his phone to verify location data and confirm where he had been on Wednesday evening, the last time Bryce was seen. Michael explained that after leaving the storage facility, he returned home, drove to Brainerd, and even visited his uncle. However, inconsistencies began to emerge in his account. The situation grew increasingly complex. Initially, it seemed as though Bryce and Cordelia were on the run from the authorities, resembling a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde traveling across the country. On the other hand, there were clear tensions between Bryce and Cordelia's father, Michael, who had openly expressed mistrust and dislike for him. To unravel the truth, investigators delved deeper into the Ilex family dynamics and the relationship between Bryce and Cordelia. Cordelia and Bryce met in February 2022, brought together by a shared love of dogs and a mutual thirst for adventure. In June 2022, just after her high school graduation, Cordelia and Bryce set off on a cross-country trip, seeking freedom from the constraints of her parents. Part of Cordelia's desire to leave stemmed from the atmosphere at home. She felt her parents were overly controlling. In the past, they had even hired a private investigator to follow her previous boyfriend. Adding to the family tension, Cordelia's mother was battling Huntington's disease, and her younger sibling, who had recently come out as transgender, was facing challenges of their own. Cordelia was a strong supporter of her sibling, but her primary source of stress was her father, Michael, whose relentless pressure made life at home unbearable. Michael Ilex was born in Pitt Lakes, a suburb of Brainerd, in 1977. His parents divorced when he was young, and his mother remarried, later having more children in her second marriage. Michael grew up with his younger half-siblings, graduated from high school in 1996, and eventually moved to the small town of Center, where he initially worked in construction. Later, he transitioned to self-employment, doing odd jobs for neighbors. Michael was deeply family-oriented, as evidenced by a tattoo on his arm that read, "Daddy's Girl," alongside an image of his daughters. Investigators circled back to Michael about Bryce's phone 10 minutes after his initial denial. At first, Michael insisted he had never handled the phone. However, he eventually admitted that he had taken it from the car and thrown it away in a trash bin at a gas station in Brainerd that same evening. He explained his actions by saying he was trying to protect his daughter. Michael confessed that he was terrified by the situation and worried that someone might track Bryce's phone and endanger Cordelia. Bryce Brogle was born in Brainerd in September 1999. At the time of his disappearance, he was 23 years old and full of dreams. Bryce aspired to build a yurt in Alaska and create a self-sufficient farm. The road trip with Cordelia was part of his quest for freedom and a life connected to nature. Their relationship had started in February 2022, and the trip symbolized their shared vision of an independent, remote lifestyle. During interrogations, investigators worked to piece together the fragments of this increasingly contradictory story. While the couple's journey across the country initially appeared idyllic, deeper issues began to surface, including family conflicts and strained relationships. Investigators pressed with questions, trying to unravel what had really happened between Cordelia, Bryce, and her family. Michael claimed that his actions were motivated by fear for his daughter's safety, but inconsistencies in his accounts led investigators to suspect he might be hiding something, or perhaps didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation himself. Standing outside the storage complex, Michael spoke with investigators, expressing both his anguish and helplessness. He explained that he had been struggling for some time to come to terms with the circumstances his daughter was caught in. Michael was forthcoming about his concerns, describing his deep unease with Bryce's behavior. He suspected that Cordelia had experienced mistreatment at Bryce's hands. According to Michael, Bryce exerted control over nearly every aspect of Cordelia's life, leaving her feeling humiliated and powerless. Michael admitted that witnessing this dynamic was deeply painful for him as a father. He believed Cordelia needed to decide for herself to end the relationship, but he also confessed that he had sometimes considered scaring Bryce into staying away from her. Michael told investigators that thoughts of revenge had crossed his mind, especially when he saw how Bryce controlled her. Despite these feelings, he insisted that he didn't want to take illegal actions and had been doing his best to protect his family through lawful means. In 1999, Michael already had legal troubles. At 21, he pleaded guilty to third-degree criminal conduct and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. This incident was a major wake-up call for him, and he tried to turn his life around to avoid similar issues in the future. However, in 2018, Michael found himself embroiled in another legal case when he was convicted of fourth-degree misconduct involving an adult who had been declared mentally incapacitated. Initially, this individual had declined to engage in any intimate relationship with Michael, but eventually complied after repeated pressure from him. As part of the investigation, Michael underwent 4 polygraph tests and claimed to have passed all of them, which he believed supported his innocence. Investigators explained to Michael that polygraph results are not admissible in Minnesota courts and cannot be used as evidence. Passing the tests didn't automatically prove innocence, though it could contribute to perceived credibility. Michael, familiar with the process, insisted he understood how polygraphs worked and pointed to his past successes as proof of his honesty. He leaned heavily on these results in an attempt to convince investigators of his truthfulness. In counseling sessions, Michael attended to address his personal issues. He often discussed his desire to protect his family. His concerns extended not only to Cordelia, but also to his younger daughter. He expressed a strong sense of responsibility for their well-being and was determined to do whatever it took to ensure their safety. Michael feared the possibility of incarceration, knowing it would leave him unable to care for his daughters. He recognized the need to tread carefully to avoid further harm to his family. Michael had confronted Bryce several times after noticing bruises on Cordelia's face. He had warned Bryce repeatedly, saying that if he saw any more signs of harm, he wouldn't just issue verbal threats. These conversations were tense, and Michael did not hide his anger. However, he defended himself to investigators, claiming that resorting to aggression against Bryce wouldn't improve the situation. He emphasized that it was ultimately up to Cordelia to recognize the unhealthy nature of her relationship and make the decision to leave. During his interviews with police, Michael frequently expressed mistrust of Bryce and often spoke about him in the past tense. He described Bryce as arrogant and prone to boasting about his supposed achievements. Michael believed that people like Bryce often struggled to handle real-life challenges and dismissed him as a fool who didn't understand the consequences of his actions. Investigators continued to analyze every aspect of the case, striving to untangle the web of contradictions and uncover the truth. The atmosphere during interrogations was tense, with each new detail adding further complexity to an already confusing narrative. Michael tried to cooperate with the investigation, but admitted he didn't have all the answers. Detectives worked to piece together the fragments of the story, which seemed increasingly contradictory. Michael's past offenses appeared to be of an entirely different nature than the suspected circumstances surrounding Bryce Brogle's disappearance just 2 days earlier. Suspicion loomed over Michael, especially after he admitted to having threatened Bryce and wanting him to stay away from his daughter. 2 days before Bryce's body was discovered, 2 of Michael Illicks's half-brothers went to the police with shocking information. They claimed that Michael had confessed to a crime. On October 28th, after being questioned at the storage facility, Michael allegedly spoke with his sister, Jen Baker, whom he had visited earlier that evening at a Halloween party. According to Jen, Michael asked to borrow her car, explaining that he feared police were watching his truck. When Jen pressed him on why he needed the vehicle, Michael admitted that he was planning to bury Bryce's body. He reportedly told her that he had shot Bryce in the back of the head and used a sled to move the body as it was too heavy to carry. Michael also mentioned grabbing a bag of leaves from her garage to help disguise the burial site. On October 29th, police obtained a warrant to search Michael's storage unit. Inside, they found a bottle of bleach on the concrete floor. Forensic analysis revealed traces of both Bryce's and Michael's DNA on the bottle. Investigators also discovered residue that tested positive for the presence of blood, as well as drag marks consistent with something heavy being moved using a sled. The sled was later found discarded in a roadside ditch near the storage facility, covered with a blanket. It bore dried residue that appeared to be blood. When investigators examined Michael's phone records, they uncovered damning evidence. On October 27th, the day after Bryce's disappearance, Michael had left his house at 4:45 a.m. and driven to his storage unit. He stayed there for 22 minutes before heading to a section of public land near Edward Lake, where he remained for another hour. These movements heightened investigators' suspicions that the storage unit had been the site of a crime. On October 30th, following location data from Michael's phone, police arrived at a wooded area near Edward Lake. The site was isolated, deep in the wilderness, and unlikely to be stumbled upon by accident. The ground showed signs of recent digging, with broken branches stuck into the soil and freshly scattered leaves that didn't match the surrounding foliage. It was clear that someone had attempted to conceal the area, but the effort was poorly executed. When an excavation team began their work, they uncovered a body buried beneath the soil. It was Bryce Brogle, and he had been shot in the back of the head. Michael quickly became the prime suspect after the discovery of Bryce's body, a development that didn't surprise investigators. It also came to light that on October 26th, Michael had taken a firearm from his half-sister Jen's house, telling her he needed it to deal with a rodent problem at a worksite. Shortly after, Bryce and Cordelia returned to Minnesota. Michael took Bryce to the storage unit, allegedly intending to provoke an argument that could lead to a report being filed against Bryce, which Michael believed would keep him away from Cordelia. According to Michael, he had the gun with him that day because he had been dealing with pests earlier. During a heated exchange, Michael accused Bryce of mistreating Cordelia. Bryce allegedly responded by claiming Cordelia belonged to him and threatening to harm her if anyone tried to take her away. Michael claimed that he fired the gun in a moment of rage, believing he was protecting his daughter. As the investigation progressed, evidence pointed to premeditation. Bryce and Cordelia's landlord in Washington state revealed that Michael had called him, asking if Bryce had ever harmed his daughter. The landlord mentioned that he had seen Cordelia with visible bruises. Michael reportedly responded by saying he planned to kill Bryce and had already dug a grave. These claims were corroborated by Michael's half-brother, who told investigators he had heard similar threats. In July 2022, just a month after starting the road trip with Bryce, Cordelia had begged Michael to come get her. However, she didn't disclose her location and later told him everything was fine. After that, her complaints stopped. Despite this, Michael remained deeply concerned for his daughter, especially when he noticed bruises on her, which she either denied or attributed to accidents. Family members suspected Michael believed Bryce was responsible for harming Cordelia. The fatal shot at the storage unit, the use of a sled to transport Bryce's body to the woods, and the haphazard attempt to conceal the burial all pointed to a plan that Michael had thought through but executed poorly. He had cleaned the storage unit, buried Bryce's body, and tried to hide the evidence. But it wasn't enough to evade capture. In November 2022, Michael was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, a crime committed without premeditation but still intentional under the law. On March 30th, 2023, the charges against Michael were elevated to first-degree murder, and a grand jury formally indicted him. The trial began in 2024. Throughout the court proceedings, Cordelia maintained that her relationship with Bryce was not abusive and stated that she had been happy with him. Her social media posts seemed to support this claim. Following her father's arrest on October 31st, she wrote that she had lost a special person who had been her guardian angel. She continued to share memories of Bryce online, never aligning herself with Michael's version of events. During the trial, Michael admitted to killing Bryce but denied that it was premeditated. He claimed that he acted impulsively, driven by a need to protect his daughter. However, the jury did not find his explanation credible. In April 2024, Michael was convicted of first-degree murder with premeditation, along with an additional second-degree murder charge. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the trial, Cordelia continued to post about Bryce on social media, sharing her thoughts and memories of him. In March 2024, she wrote about how often she thought of Bryce and how much she missed him. The story of Michael Ilix and Bryce Brogle is a tragic example of how deep-seated suspicion and a lack of trust can lead to irreversible consequences. Michael, as a father, was unable to control his emotions and fears, which drove him to commit a horrific crime. His actions, fueled by fear and anger, resulted in the death of a young man and the destruction of his own daughter's life. The jury rejected his defense, and Michael received a life sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder of the importance of resolving conflicts peacefully and fostering trust with loved ones, rather than resorting to destructive actions born from anger or suspicion.